The question must therefore be considered whether in sense certainty itself the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be, whether this notion of it as the essence corresponds to the way it is present in sense certainty. To this end, we have not only to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth, but only to consider the way in which it is present in sense certainty. In section 94, which is a very short passage, Hegel is saying, look, now we need to actually formulate our question. We need to think about how we're going to ask this. That's important to figure out exactly what you're asking about. And then how we'll go about resolving that question. What should we do? What shouldn't we do? So really the question the questions that are being explored here and that are going to be grappled with in the rest of this sense certainty section are these. How is the object really present in sense certainty? What's really going on when we're perceiving something through our senses as immediate, as just what it is? How does that really work? Is it the way that, like I put here, the follow-up question, is it really the way that sense certainty says that it is? You know, the sense certainty's pretense is that I'm just giving you the thing as it is. I'm not adding anything to it. You're not adding anything to it. You're getting the straight thing, unadulterated, pure, just experiential. Is that really what's going on when we're having that kind of relation of knowledge to an object? Now, Hegel is going to frame this a little bit more precisely by saying, does the notion of it as essence, so does the Begriff, the concept, what we're able to work out as we're thinking our way through this, as we're following out the twists and turns of what reveal themselves to us in sense certainty, does the notion of it as essence, that is, the object as what is most real, as impinging upon us, as sort of giving itself in its full concreteness, in its true reality to us, the perceivers, does that really correspond to how it is in sense certainty? Or have we made a mistake? Are we misrepresenting to ourselves the way sense certainty works? This is quite important because what he's attacking here is, you might say, the imaginary element in empiricism. Empiricists and people who appeal to common sense are quite often saying, look, things just are the way they are. You just kind of take them in. You're not actually adding anything to them unless you're biased or you're filtering things out. But if you're ready to just take it in as it is, then there's nothing that you're changing in it. Hegel's saying, well, I don't know that that's actually the case. Why don't we look at sense certainty, see what goes on, and see whether it measures up to its own pretensions? Now, he does counsel something that's quite important here at the end of it. He says, we have not to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth. We can't do an armchair analysis of this, where we just kind of think, what is it like to have a sensory experience? We have to have some basis upon which to work. So there is a kind of empiricism going on here, but it's an empiricism that's more radical than the typical empiricism, even the ones that call themselves radical empiricism. He says we have to consider the way in which it really is present in sense certainty. So we need to look at how sense certainty works. It is, then, sense certainty itself that must be asked, what is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape of its being as now and as here, the dialectic it has in it will receive a form as intelligible as the this itself is. To the question, what is now? Let us answer, for example, now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment will suffice. We write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, we shall have to say that it has become stale. In section 95, Hegel is going to actually ask sense certainty, what's going on here? Tell me about how the object actually is for you. What do you make of this? What is the this? What is the object that you say is so independent, is the essential thing, that the I doesn't really matter, that knowledge is merely of the object? Well, what is this? And it arrives in a sort of doubled form. And this makes sense when we think about the ways in which we perceive things. In general, we perceive a now at this time. Of course, it's rather difficult, and we're going to see that you can't actually hold on to a now. And then in space, a here. Not over there, but here. When we're having an experience, and it's presenting it to us in this sort of, supposedly unmediated way, we're conscious of the now and here. We say that we're present in the moment, and the moment includes both, a spatial and a temporal sort of dimension to them. But then we can ask, that's fine. What's now? Now notice what has to happen. Sense certainty has to specify something about the now. It also is going to have to specify something about the here. So, we could pick anything we want. We could say that, well, the time itself determines it, and so it imposes itself upon us, but, we can also sort of in our imagination say, well, let's pick 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock or, make up whatever we want. Hegel goes with night. Now is night. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording that, that's not the case, but perhaps while you're watching that, that is the case. And here's where we get to what's really important in this. He says, in order to test the truth of this sense certainty, now notice what he's doing. We're taking certainty, Gewissheit, and we want to test the truth of it. You might say, well, why would you test the truth of certainty? I mean, what it means to be certain about something is you don't need to test the truth of it because you already know that it's true. You're certain of it. Well, no, you're not. Because if you really were, then you wouldn't be so defensive when somebody says, how can you be certain of your certainty? How do you know that your certainty is true? That defensiveness is itself a sort of affective correlate to an epistemological problem. How do we know the truth of sense certainty? We say that it's night, and we can test it. So he says, we write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down. We've written it down right here. Right? It's being imposed through pixels on your screen, whatever it is that you're watching this upon. We write down this truth. The truth cannot lose anything by being written down, any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it, through our remembering it, through our keeping it going in language. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, what happens? Is it night right now? If it's noon, it's not. So this doesn't have a truth anymore. And what's really interesting about this passage, Hegel doesn't say, oh yeah, now it's just become false. Truth is just a correlate to falsity, and it sort of fluctuates back and forth. Sort of like the example of a broken watch is right twice a day, because it's going to sooner or later wind up at that point. He says that this truth has now become stale. It's become shal. It's become outworn. It's become outmoded. It no longer works for us. It's insipid. So, what's going on here? Notice what Hegel has done. he's forced us to specify in sense certainty just what the this is supposed to be. Now we're stuck with a now and a here, and whenever we have a now, we have to pick a particular now, and that makes us a bit vulnerable to that now no longer being what it was that we thought it was. And we're doing this just by unpacking what's going on in sense certainty. The now that is night is preserved. That is, it is treated as what it professes to be, as something that is. But it proves itself to be, on the contrary, something that is not. The now does indeed preserve itself, but is something that is not night. Equally, it preserves itself in the face of the day that it now is, as something also that is not day. In other words, as a negative in general. This self-preserving now is therefore not immediate, but mediated. For it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else, that is day and night, is not. As so determined, it is still just as simply now as before, and in this simplicity is indifferent to what happens in it. Just as little as day and night are its being, just as much also is it day and night. It is not in the least affected by this its other being. A simple thing of this kind, which is, through negation, which is neither this nor that, a not this, and is with equal indifference this as well as that, such a thing we call a universal. So it is in fact the universal that is the true content of sense certainty. In section 96, we're arriving at another critical juncture where we're going to get the introduction of the universal. So let's see how we actually get there. Again, we're watching to see what happens within sense certainty when we interrogate it about how it actually plays out. You know, when you're dealing with a here or a now, what does that determinately mean for the consciousness that's supposed to be purely immediate? So if we think about the preservation that's going on of the night that no longer exists because now it's day, Hegel says that the now that is night is preserved. It is kept in play. It's treated as what it professes to be, as something that is. So we have now is night is something that is in a certain sense. But we know that that's not actually the whole story. Notice that I didn't say not actually the case, just not the whole story, because it's also something that is not, because it is day. So now is night, and that's preserved in a certain way, and now is also not night because it's day. And we can change the polarities if we want. We can change it to day and say that day does the same thing when it goes to nighttime, or when it's twilight, or whatever you want to bring up. So where do we go from here? He says the now does preserve itself. Here's where a key transition is taking place. The now preserves itself, but is something that is not night. Equally, it preserves itself in the face of the day that it now is, as something that also is not day. Now is greater than night or day. Now could be either one of them, and it can go back and forth. So now is actually something that is different from night and is different from day. And here we get into some really interesting logic. You might say, well, it's got to be one or the other. No, it doesn't. Could be dawn. Well, dawn is part of day. Well, if you want to quibble that sort of thing, we can always keep introducing more and more distinctions. And you're still going to wind up with the same problem. Even if you added in 3 possibilities or 10 possibilities, you'd have the same dialectic taking place. So he says, it's not night and it's not day. In other words, it is a negative in general. So what we took to be pure determinacy, now, what could be more concrete than now, turns out to be a negation. Turns out to be something negative. Turns out to be something that's almost empty, just waiting for content to fill it. He goes on and he says, this self-preserving now is not immediate but mediated, for it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now. We'll look at that in a moment. So determined as a self-preserving now through the fact that something else is not. So this is a mediation. This is a mediation. The now, as a negation, possesses more being or is more essential than either one of these two determinate qualities or quantities or, whatever you want to call them, whatever modality you want to ascribe to them. So he says, the self-preserving now is a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else is not. As so determined, it is just as simply now as before. And this simplicity is indifferent to what happens in it. So it can contain day or it can contain night, but it doesn't care. Because it's going to remain now just as much when it's day as when it's night. It doesn't really matter as far as the now is concerned, what content you want to shove in there. It'll continue being this now forever. It is purely simple. Let's go on. So he says, just as little as day and night are its being, just as much also is it day and night. So there's something paradoxical being said here. Day and night are not the being of the now, nor are, say, noon and midnight, or any particular hour of the day, and yet it is those things at the same time. Now, doesn't that strike you as a little bit strange? Doesn't that seem to violate the law of non-contradiction? A thing can't be and not be in the same way at the same time. Or can it? There's one kind of thing that Hegel says does that. A universal. A universal both is the thing of which it is the things of which it is a universal, and it is not them. It relates itself to them in a way that both negates them and enfolds them into itself. That allows them to be the content for it and says, you're not the whole show. I'm the main show. I'm the thing that gives you what you are. You contribute mere determinacy. I contribute essence. I contribute what it is to be what you are. So he goes on and he says, a simple thing of this kind which is through negation, which is neither, in this case, this, nor that, and not this, and it is with equal indifference also this and that. Such a thing we call a universal. So what do we have here? Sense certainty was supposed to be about concrete things. It was supposed to be about the immediate experience, not about universals. But this shows us that the truth of sense certainty is indeed the universal. That's what sense certainty really is providing us with when we start digging down into it and paying attention to what's going on. It is as a universal that we utter what the sensuous content is. When what we say is this, that is the universal this, or it is, that is being in general. Of course, we do not envisage the universal this or being in general, but we utter the universal. In other words, we do not strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say. But language, as we see, is the more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. Immediately after hitting us with this realization that sense certainty involved something that we didn't think that it did, namely the universal, which seemed to be exactly the opposite of what sense certainty and the kind of experience and knowledge that it promised us was all about, Hegel's going to hit us with yet another major revelation, which is that language is at the very heart of what's going on here, and that this opposition that we have here between language is dealing with the universal and the sense certainty is dealing with the particular really is not going to hold, in part because language is at the core of the truth of sense certainty, just as much as the universal is. There's a paradoxicality to sense certainty, which is that it cannot be what it promised originally. It has to be something that seems exactly at the opposite end of the spectrum from it. But this is what dialectical analysis shows us. So he says, it is as a universal that we utter what the sensuous content is. So before we go into the more abstract universal this, let's think about what happens when we are using language. So we have this, relationship now between consciousness, the pure I, and the object, the sensuous content over here. And the relationship is one of knowledge. Sense certainty is supposed to be immediate knowledge. We've seen that it's not really immediate. But let's just say that for the time being that is, because we don't need to contest that. When we speak about it, when we express or utter what that thing over there is, like when we said here, or said day or night as part, when we say now, said day or night as part of the now. Later on it's going to be tree and other things instead of the here. As soon as we begin speaking, not just thinking, but speaking, as soon as we begin using language, we are dealing with the universal. As we've seen, the universal is interesting because it is at the same time an affirmation and a negation of all of the particulars that universal relates itself to. It is not those particulars, and yet it also is those particulars. In some ways, it's more those particulars than those particulars are themselves. This is all relations of mediation, as we've just seen in previous discussions. So, as soon as consciousness begins treating the sensuous content as something particular, it also has to universalize it in order to make sense of it. So it's not so receptive or immediate as we originally took it to be. That's not what's going on in sense certainty. Because if you can ask somebody, what are you watching? What are you looking at? What do you taste? And they're able to respond with anything, as soon as they respond, they're engaging with the universal. How does that chocolate taste? Good, sweet, bitter. Those are universals. Tastes chocolatey. That's universal. What are you watching? A bunch of birds. Now, you didn't describe, I see 41 birds and they're, arranged in all these ways, because you can't do that in language. Language works by means of universalizing, of making things less concrete, more abstract. But it's through that we're able to have the concrete as concrete. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to understand it. So let's go on now. He says, what about the this, the universal this? Well, that is being in general. Now we're not just talking about one thing. We're talking about beings as such. We're doing metaphysics here. He says, we don't envisage the universalness or being in general. That's a really interesting thing to think about. What is the universalness? What is being in general? What does it taste like? How does it impress itself upon you? Let's get away from sense things and let's talk about feelings. What's your feeling about being? We don't have that sort of thing. It's something that we can speak, something that we can think, but it's not something that we can perceive through the senses. So sense perception, sense certainty has led us away from the senses as such. He says we don't envisage the universal this or being in general. We utter the Aussagen. We utter the universal. We don't strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say. So language by its very nature does tend to conceal or to distort or to change the thing that it's trying to express. But it's the only game in town. It's the only way you are going to express it. So when somebody asks you about the sensuous content, you have to respond in language, thereby universalizing it, thereby mediating it, thereby changing it to a certain extent, thereby making sense certainty something very different than what it purported to be. So he says language is actually more truthful. Sense certainty showed us that it's kind of deceptive. It isn't really certainty. It doesn't really provide the most concrete truth. It really leads us into other things. Language, though, is more truthful. Why? We directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. We're confronted with a limit that we can't actually express with universals, the universals of language or thought, exactly what it is that we are experiencing, exactly what we are perceiving as receptive, beings sensuously engaged with the world of experience. We're already distorting it just by the mere fact of naming things. But like I said, that's the only game in town. Sense certainty has, under investigation, shown us to be the case. So language is, in a certain respect, more truthful because of that. It says the universal is the true content of sense certainty. Now, notice one other thing that we're going to sort of close with as we get ready to move into some even deeper discussions. Where have we posed this impossibility of ever truly saying what it is that we intend in terms of the particular? Where have we laid that problematic out? You might say, on the chalkboard, Dr. Sadler. But how have I done that? This is all language. Sure, there's a few, arrows and things like that, but those are symbols as well. They're supposed to represent relations. It is in language that we are able to represent to ourselves and grasp the truth of the impossibility of, with language, grasping the truth of the sensuous particular, which means that the sensuous particular, as such, is an abstraction that has been brought into the realm of language, into the realm of thought, into the realm of the concept, the Hegelian Begriff. What we've seen happen here is that sense certainty has been aufgehoben. It's been, you can call it sublation or transcended. We're moving away from anything like a pure sense certainty, and now we're in the realm of language.